Back as the province of Ontario imposed a second state of emergency amid this COVID-19 pandemic and asked its citizens to stay at home, there was some confusion about the rules and the messaging, especially how this lockdown compares to the first lockdown that was imposed back in March. Wojtek Dabrowski is with us now. He's the founder of Provident Communications. Wojtek, thank you for being with us. One thing that I did, a sort of fun exercise, was to try to compare kind of language by language this lockdown announcement to the March one. And there are some key differences, and there's a lot more wiggle room. So do you think it's fair to say that Ontarians are right to be confused about the so-called rules of the lockdown?
I think no matter how hard you try, you can't with a straight face say that these are not confusing. We got a 2,100 word press release, which at the best of times, and I write a lot of these for clients, is not a recommended length of a press release at all. We had 6 different government officials quoted in that press release, essentially saying various flavors of the same thing. And then among all of that, Ontarians like you and me and like everybody watching are being asked to sort of decipher and decode, much like you did by comparing to previous language, what it is that exactly we should be doing. You know, the Premier says it's a very simple message. Stay at home, don't go out unless it's essential. That last piece of that phrase, unless it's essential, is really, really important, because what essential means defines what's allowed. And the government has just simply not defined the meaning of the word essential. In fact, it put out a 3-page Q&A to try to dispel some of this confusion, which, by the way, the Premier said, of course, no one is feeling and shouldn't be confused because it's so simple, in which they're asked, what's an essential job? What's an essential reason for leaving the home? None of that is defined. None of that is answered. So the long way of answering your question, I think it's very clear that it's impossible not to be confused by what we're all expected to be obeying here.
And one of the tricky parts of all of this, of course, Wojtek, is that you're communicating a message. And as a communications expert, you have to do this regularly. And that is you're communicating a message that people don't want to hear. It's an unpleasant one. Right. It's not good news. Right. And it's to a population that is really fatigued. They've 2/3 of whom think they've been doing, enough already. They've been sticking to the rules. 1/3 of who for whatever reason can't or won't stick to the rules. Is the reason we get vagueness because it would be too hard to say to people, go home, stay home. These are the list of businesses open. All non-essential businesses are going to close, and that list is going to be very small, because people would simply throw up their hands and say, we've had it. We can't do this for another month or more, because let's keep in mind, if this doesn't work, it could go on beyond 28 days.
Look, I think people are already throwing up their hands. You're pointing to 1/3 of Ontarians that are already not complying. There's nothing that the Ford government put out this week that is going to help that. The reality is that the message has been simple from every level of government, from the city, the province, and the federal government: stay at home, stay apart, and let's squash this thing together. It's once you get past that and you start asking the why and the how that things get really tricky. And I think the opportunity certainly exists for the government to define what they mean by essential and to be a lot more explicit about the guidance that they're giving. Sometimes it's really helpful to cast this in an analogy, right? And let's say you have a kid at home who's watching much too much YouTube, and you're trying to get them to stop because they're spending way too much time on the screen. At the same time, you're saying, well, some of the YouTube channels that you watch are necessary for you to complete your studies. You need them for school. Here's the computer password. Use your best judgment, which is literally what the Premier said yesterday. Use your best judgment. We're counting on Ontarians to use their best judgment to figure this out going forward. I would say to you, if I'm already not complying, my best judgment is that your rules make no sense or are too difficult to follow. I'm not going to follow them. And the reality is that for every individual who's confused by the messaging that they're hearing, and, this is, by the way, not a thing that began this week. It's a pattern of behavior where we've had announcements from the education minister in Ontario saying that schools would reopen, only to 4 days later mysteriously remain closed for an additional what's going on to be now 4 weeks, without any explanation why that shift in messaging happened seemingly overnight. Again, you're asking a lot of a province of Canadians, of Ontarians who are exhausted from dealing with this for a year. And I think from a communication standpoint, the counsel we'd be giving is you owe these people a minimum of certainty and as much clarity as you can provide. And I think that bar is simply not being met on certainly the messaging and content side, but it also seems like it's not being met on the process side, right? And I think you heard that from the fire chief here in Toronto, who's in charge of the city's response, reading that press release and saying, this is literally the first I'm seeing of this. I'm not sure how we're going to be able to deploy people to enforce this stuff.
There's the enforcement side of it, and the thing that jumped out at me, it's in the same vein, Wojtek, but was to see the mayor of Toronto, which governs a lot of those outdoor recreational spaces, kind of sounding confused himself. You're not supposed to go to outdoor spaces unless they're open, and yet the hockey rinks are open. So he's sort of saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Are people supposed to go to the rinks or not supposed to go to the rinks? When the two levels of government don't even seem to agree or have come to some terms, do you think we're going to see that 1/3 non-compliance number go up, or ironically, in this time of heightened lockdown? Or will we just, because we have the language, because there will be people who want to do their best, we will see a little more compliance than we had seen?
I think it's a very good question to ask, but I think the answer, unfortunately, is a disappointing one, and that is that we're not going to see higher compliance. I mean, you look at the announcement from this week, it's riddled with loopholes, okay? There's a special carve-out, for example, for performing essential maintenance on your cottage. I would say, based on just the emails and text message I've received since this became public, with many of my colleagues and associates saying it looks like we're able to go to our cottages, this is fantastic news. That is not the way the government wants you to be interpreting these rules, right? But at the same time, they're saying if you have essential maintenance on your cottage, use your best judgment to determine what that is. Well, do you need to have 3 shingles hanging off your roof or 5, or is 1 enough? And who's the ultimate arbiter of that? I think you're inviting a lot of exhausted, confused, and worn out, and frankly angry people who have seen, the government's own ministers and staff violate the stay-at-home orders. You're asking them to do a lot more with a lot less clarity and a lot less coordination between the various levels of government. I think the only possible outcome is lower compliance, unfortunately higher caseloads as a result, and more people getting put into hospitals, ICUs, and losing life.
All right. And just because I can clarify one point, I think it is clear that you're not supposed to go to your second home. That's been established. If you need to go, you're supposed to go for less than a day, less than 24 hours. So go do your maintenance and leave again. We're just seconds here, Wojtek. But if you think compliance will be lesser, does that follow that you think the lockdown will be extended if it doesn't work, or that they'll give up on it because it doesn't work?
I think the government has no choice but to extend it. You don't see it a way out of this through giving up. I know that you were going at warp speed in terms of trying to vaccinate people, but in the absence of that, until there are needles in arms across the province, we need to stay at home, and we need to not go to cottages, second homes, or frankly anywhere else unless we absolutely have